incubator, and lately we have come to assets under management because some of our investors trusted us, and with some money that we can create a portfolio. So that's our third pillar, is that we now have become our own, or we have become an investor ourselves and have created a portfolio. So that is the third one. So incubator, matchmaking, and investing, that's what we do in impact investing.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That sounds very interesting and very helpful. So I hope people can stay in touch with you and grow together with Leanox as well. Next we have Stefan. Stefan is the Senior Advisor for US Operations for Worldwide Generation. Stefan, would you like to say a word as well?
Yes, Charlotte, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me today to Entnest and to this event to join Paulina and Eleni. So Worldwide Generation is a data assurance and validity platform in the impact and sustainability space. And what we do is we gather data, analyze it, and benchmark it across all of the benchmarks and standards that are available today, both domestically and internationally, for impact and sustainability. And we do this for companies. We can do this for investors who are building a pipeline of opportunities and want to understand inside that pipeline whether or not they truly have impact and sustainable ventures and what they're doing. And our sustainability reporting can be used as part of 10K forms if you're a public company, or if you're a private and emerging company and you want to use it for fundraising, you can do that as well. We have the most, I think, the most granular and thorough and complete validity and assurance that's out there. Using our platform, you will very confidently know that you are sustainable and impactful, and we show you exactly where you're doing it and where you're not doing it. And our platform is tied to the UN SDG goals, but we also can do ESG measures as well.
That's great, thank you. We'll have a question more on that coming later. And then we have our third speaker, Eleni, who's the founder of Sintali. Maybe can you tell us more what you do and just a bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm less on the investing, more on the entrepreneur side. And so I co-founded Sintali, which is a startup which is looking to transform the built environment. We are an environmental verification organization, which sounds like a mouthful, but essentially we're sustainability fact checkers for buildings. So when companies say that they are building green, we go in and we check against a World Bank green building standard called EDGE. We work in currently 75 countries and really trying to break down the barriers of perception around what a green building is, and that green buildings are expensive and green buildings are a luxury good, and really trying to push out the message that actually every single building on this planet, whether it's new or existing, whether it's in Peru or Ghana or the UK or the US, can and should be green. So we're really trying to work with partners and institutions around the world, and working a lot with banks and investors actually to make sure that they know what a green building is when they're investing, and then also with the developers and asset owners to also help them build green.
That is awesome. Well, thank you so much. It sounds like you're doing really great work, and especially something important when we look at the cities we're building for the future, and like you said, also what we've built so far. So thank you to all three of you for joining in. And now that we know a bit about you, there's a few questions that I would like to ask to then spark some discussion during the breakout rooms and the networking time. So without further ado, I would like to ask you, looking back at the past 2 years and the beginning of this year, it's been a pretty crazy time, a lot of changes, a lot of things regarding health, peace, the environment, and impact investing has grown enormously, and impact entrepreneurship as well. Just it's become such a big topic and such a salient one. And with that, we see a lot of new players entering this field. Which players have you seen recently move into impact investing and entrepreneurship, and which do you think are relevant for us to keep an eye for and keep an eye on in the coming year? Maybe I'm going to ask Paulina to start. I see you're smiling.
Of course. Yeah, so maybe let's start like from the big picture. What kind of investors are there? So there's like industrial investors and private investors, right? So on industrial investors, the bigger ones are like corporates, investment banks, private equity and VCs. Those are the bigger ones. And then you have like family office SMEs and maybe startups on the lower budget end, so to say. And then you have private investors with high net worth individuals and maybe lower net worth individuals. And my theory towards this question is that the higher the budget, the more likely that they have been to already have included impact investing as part of their portfolio. So let's say an investment bank, they have a big portfolio and they might have invested in impact in order to diversify, and they have also invested in real estate and in oil and commodities or something, but they use this in order to diversify. And that's perfectly fine. But in order to kind of move it to the mainstream, we need to have more investments, of course, and we also need to create products for those smaller investors or smaller corporates. So takeaway one then would be that the more money there is in the investor or portfolio, the bigger the portfolio is, the more likely are they to diversify by investing in that, or having a branch that focuses solely on investment banking, on impact investing. And then the second thing that comes with that is that the players that have money, that they might have a higher risk aversion, because the money that they have is maybe, they need to be very careful with it. But then if they now go into impact investing with, let's say, a private investor with 5K or 10K that they want to invest, they go into impact investing.
Bonjour Elena, ça va? Ah, vous allez retourner?
Someone is unmuted, I think. That's okay.
Ah, écoute. Ah, vous l'allez pas prendre ici?
Let me try to, Christian.
I don't know.
I apologize. I'm gonna try to mute.
No problem at all. I'm gonna continue. So the bigger players probably invested in order to diversify, and the lower ones, those are the ones that I think are going to enter the space, and that creates an opportunity. And I think this opportunity is for the bigger players to create solutions and products and startups, hopefully, that will serve those needs of smaller, of course, only in a budget-wise manner, but in those lower net worth individual, private investors or industrial investors. This is kind of my take on this. And then maybe lastly, I have seen an increasing, yet very, very, very small, but still increasing number in female-founded startups. And I do think that I hope I will support that this will continue, because they bring a new light and the new ideas. And I think this is also something that everyone should look out for.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, that's great insight. As you said, we have basically two different worlds, right? Of a lot to invest and less to invest, and how can we serve both market and both type of investors. Maybe Eleni, you come from the side of the founders. Are you seeing new type of founders, new type of ventures coming into the market that you would like to speak on?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I'm constantly amazed just how many companies are coming out over the last 2 years. I think there's been a huge boom as people have taken the last 2 years to just evaluate things, take a pause, figure out what's important to them, and kind of reshift. And a lot of people, I think, are looking for the autonomy, but also the creativity that comes through entrepreneurship, and people just genuinely want to do good. And so this impact entrepreneurship is really booming. I mean, for a long time, I felt almost uncomfortable at the notion. I was like, impact entrepreneur, like, what does that even mean? And you know, how do you identify as that? But I think there's so many different people trying to solve challenges and do it in a way that's redefining business. And I think that's what's really interesting. And so you're starting to see ideas that in the past might have been charities, or they might have been volunteering, that's now bringing in that enterprise element, that's bringing in this, you know, company for good or social enterprise, or pure like for-profit business, but still with this higher purpose. So seeing a lot happening in food and transportation. I mean, you know, the whole mobility sector in and of itself has been booming for a long time and will continue. But I think it's also, there's been a lot of change also in terms of end products and services. So a lot's happening around data. So I'd be very curious to get Stefan's actually opinion on this, because I think a lot of the, as I don't want to call it ESG, I don't want to call it sustainability, but let's call this broader umbrella of good things. There's a lot happening right now, which is how do we get data to better drive decisions? How do we get AI involved? How do we start to bring and connect the dots between all of these different initiatives? And I think for me, that's also continues to be the biggest gap in the market, is that there are thousands of things happening out there. But how do you make sure people aren't doing the same amount of work trying to solve the same problem, and instead build that collaborative solution, connect different types of initiatives, and really drive impact in a more effective way? But I think those are kinds of the areas that I'm seeing, at least from my side, and definitely in buildings, a lot around, you know, integrating IoT, sustainability, net zero, automation, the data side. Companies are trying to now do that all in one, whereas before you would have one company that's doing sustainability, one company that's doing the IoT home, one company that's doing the energy management system. And now you're starting to see this innovation and trying to bring it all together and really accelerate impact.
Right, thank you. That brings up such a great question of how to make it all happen together, which is sometimes a different way from what we think of entrepreneurship. We think of such an individualistic way of doing entrepreneurship. So the impact topics does bring up the question of, okay, how do we bring everybody together and make it happen together? So that is a great question. You mentioned wanting Stefan's opinion on this, so that gives me the leeway to Stefan.
Well, I can't follow up what Paulina and Eleni just said, because it was brilliant, and they did touch on all of the really hot points of what's happening. I mean, we're emerging from 2 years of devastation, not just from a health perspective, but from an economic perspective, from an infrastructure and supply chain perspective. We still have a massive supply chain problem here in the United States, and I'm sure elsewhere in the world. And that's not going to be solved overnight. But it does create an opportunity for impact and entrepreneurs to look at it and say, where are the hardest hit areas? Where are the areas of the world in which there's an abundance of natural resources that we can transform our operating models, our business models, and our way of life to be more sustainable, to be more impactful, but also provide a great return, you know, because we have to be mindful that investors are, at the end of the day, going to be looking for that great return. But the shift I'm starting to see, especially from like sovereign wealth fund managers, are kind of what I call guilt investing. So they've made all this money in, you know, dirty areas of fossil fuel extraction and manufacturing with dirty products. And now they're having like a guilty conscience, and they're going, well, wait a minute, I've made millions and millions and millions. And my kids and my grandkids are screaming at me that I'm the devil incarnate. I need to do something good. Before I leave this earth, I need to do something good. And so I've been seeing over the last year, people have been reaching out to me individually saying, hey, you're really tied into this industry. Are you seeing entrepreneurs? Are you seeing deal flow? Where can I put my money? How can I measure it effectively so that I know I'm getting a great return? Yeah, these are all definite concerns. And I think that we as entrepreneurs and investors have a joint responsibility to work together to solve these challenges.
Right, thank you. No, I absolutely agree, and it's really interesting to get this insight on going back to the players. Who are these people who were very successful and now look back and choose, okay, maybe I can give back with this money. But this brings me to a different point. Okay, we have all these people interested in bringing money to impact investing and the impact ventures, but we don't have one standard. We don't have a way that measures easily the impact of a venture. I cannot say this venture is 2 out of 10 on impact. And that is an issue because how do we measure it? How do we know we can trust to invest with a specific VC or with into a specific venture if we're doing it directly? And how can startup themselves or founders show to investors, okay, I'm really doing the work, I'm really promoting change here? So what I want to ask you all, and maybe we can start again from Stefan, who was the last one before. What are the issues, what are the standards, first of all, metrics, because they're not standards so far, but I know there's the ESG, or we were mentioning a few options before to kind of get an idea of the impact of a venture, but what is out there and what is the issue with the fact that we don't have a general standard, and what can investors, what can founders, what can all the players do to be able to overcome this issue until we do get to a standard?
Well, the easy answer would be to sign up for our platform, but that's not fair. No, it's a great question, and it's a question that not only entrepreneurs struggle with, but you know, businesses, both public and private, struggle with it. Governments are struggling with it, and I don't think that there is an easy answer, except that there are two forces that can push it. One is regulatory and compliance from governments, and we're already starting to see this in Ecuador. Here in the US, the SEC has released a mandate for US companies to report on climate risk. The Canadian government has just recently issued a mandate for insurance companies and banks to report on climate risk. In North America, we're far behind Europe and Asia. We need to catch up to them. There are a myriad of standards, and really the way to look at it is that everyone is trying to solve the same problem, but in a different way. So the best way to try and attack this is to get some form of standardization in the questions that you ask and the data that you're looking for. And that's damn near impossible. In part because you're talking about different industries, you're talking about different sizes of companies, regions of the world, access to resources, access to technology, access to capital. There are all these factors that go into it. So the approach that we take at Worldwide Generation is to meet you where you are. That's kind of our tagline, is we meet you where you are. So if you're just starting your sustainability journey and you want to build a green building, we would want you to go talk to Eleni and say, help us with the measures, help us be standardized on what we need to do to build these houses, build these homes, or build these buildings. And if you don't know where that information is, we can help you get that information. I think that ultimately what's going to happen is that governments are going to push to get some uniformity. It's happening in Europe. It will happen here in North America. It will eventually happen in Latin America. We're seeing Ecuador take a lead on this. And that I think that more participation, both by private companies and public companies, we're going to start to be able to look at the data and see where the gaps are, both in terms of knowledge and understanding and in reporting. And once that happens, then we can start to produce. Then SASB can become, for instance, FASB, right? Then it becomes generally accepted accounting principles. That's what we need to get to. We need to get to GAAP, and we will get there as we get more data and more reporting, and we get to examine all this and see where people are falling down and where people are succeeding, and we'll close and shrink that gap. So that was a long-winded way of saying, yeah, we got a lot of work to do, but the good news is there are ways to get there.
That's great, thank you. And thank you for simplifying it at the end. Maybe
Did I?
like...
I'm not sure I did.
I think you did. I think I see some nodding faces in the audience. Okay. Maybe Eleni, would you like to add anything? As a founder, you have a very different perspective, but probably agree.
Yeah, so I actually used to work at a corporate sustainability consultancy. So I feel like I've also experienced the big company trying to figure out which standards to report on, as well as the founder side of things. And I think, you know, three things stand out to me. One, and I completely agree with Stefan, is, you know, regulation drives this kind of behavior, right? So, you know, in the UK now it's mandatory for the task force for climate risk reporting, similarly to what's happening in the US. The EU is trying to make all of this mandatory, and so that's good. But here's the catch. It's only publicly listed companies or very big companies. And in the UK, for example, the majority of businesses are SMEs. And when you get into SME land, you enter I don't have the resources, I don't have the data, I don't have the time to even think about this, which is a whole big wave of resources and initiatives that the UK government, the UN is pushing, and I'm sure this is true in many countries around the world. How do you help these smaller entities to really quantify their impact and think about their reporting? Now, there is the SME problem, which is, again, kind of the resource side. And then there's the startup problem, which I'm going to say is another layer, which is, I have an idea, I'm in the beginning of developing my company, so I don't have any data on my impact because I still have an MVP or a prototype, or I've had a year's worth of operations as a one-woman show. So what is my impact depending on how you define it? And then you start going into, well, then what is the impact of your potential product and your potential customers? And then you go into, there's something called your footprint, which is, you know, your own impact versus your handprint, which is the positive impact that your product and your customers are having. If it sounds complicated, it is. And so I think there's different elements of the reporting question. One is the established organization, standardization, you know, figuring out it as close enough as possible, coming away from the alphabet soup of standards and thinking about, you know, what are 2 or 3 standards. Then there's the smaller organizations figuring out how to find the resources and do it in the most cost-effective way for them, because it's hard to prioritize, even though I'm sure in many cases it is prioritized. And then as entrepreneurs, it's figuring out what kind of information are investors actually looking for? Are they looking for the potential number of lives that you're going to change? Are they looking at the fact that you are going to be a net zero business because the way that you set it up from the beginning means that you're completely, you know what your emissions are going to be, you know what your supply chain is going to come, you've set up your governance straight up from, you know, from inception, that everything is going to be sustainable and impact driven. I think on startup land, I personally spent years trying to figure out how to set it up to be the most impactful and ethical and great organization, and kind of realized that some questions have to come down the line, which means that if investors are asking those questions in the early stages, they also need to be specific in what they're looking for. And I'd be curious to hear Paulina's perspective on that. One closing thought from my side, in general, I think with any systems, any kind of reporting, the best way for impact is to go with an independent system, right? There's something that an organization has set up, there's clear criteria, and there's some kind of verification component to it, whatever that is, because in the world that we live in, with the internet, with thousands of pieces of news coming out, it's so easy to say, I'm doing something that's impact driven. I have, you know, reduced carbon by 50,000 tons and I have saved 1,000 lives. And it's so quick and it's so easy and people don't have time to fact check. And so if we're truly driving an impact conversation and impact reporting, there should just be, at least the basic is, use one of the schemes, use an independent scheme with some kind of verification, at least as the baseline, even if they're different and not quite asking the same questions.
Absolutely. You know, I think you're underscoring how layered this issue is, right? We're not looking just at any type of business, any type of venture, depending on the stage they're in, differs in their needs, and any type of investor does as well. So I think it's a great suggestion to have multiple options, but an independent entity actually granting that these do hold to the standards that we want them to. Maybe I see there's a couple raised hands. I'm gonna let Paulina give her opinion on this, and then we can answer the questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Stefan and Eleni. Super interesting, and I agree with both of you 100%. Eleni, I really loved what you said with the gap standard, for that there are some for bigger ones, but not really for smaller ones. And that made me think of, you know, the bigger ones, most of them, of course, most of them don't focus on impact. So they do it as like something that they have to do. So with putting bureaucratic things on it, it makes it harder, and it lowers the incentive for them, of course. With the smaller ones, they would like to have proof of their impact for investors, if they're startups, for example, but there's no such thing as a generally known verification or a certificate or something like this. There are different ones, yes, but as we said, very different ones, and it's not always clear how they measure impact and all of this. So this is also a big problem that I see, and that I also feel from the entrepreneurs that we talk about. And then that leads me to agreeing with Stefan again, because you said meet you where you are, and that's something I really like, because a general standard will give an advantage to some, but then disadvantage others if it's not in the right industry and so on, because you cannot always ask the right questions for everyone, and you cannot give the points, and industries and companies are so different that it will be very hard and almost impossible to find the right standard there. And if you would like to do that and create all the questions, then it's going to be so bureaucratic that it's almost as horrible as the German bureaucracy, which is something we do not want as a standard in this. Absolutely not. That should not be the goal. So I don't have an answer, but I know that we need something that is efficient and widely known and accepted, and maybe could be communicated also more. Standard is always something, okay, you have to fulfill something, maybe going about it with certificates or something like this could of course also be an option, especially for the smaller players, let's say. That would maybe be a start.
Right, thank you for closing the circle on this question. That's great insight. I see there's two people with their hands up. Maybe Paulina, you can go first, asking the question, different Paulina from our speaker.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you for all the speakers. This is 50% a question, 50% a comment. It's building up on what you were discussing. But I work as a communications consultant and a copywriter. And of course, in the communication sense, the measurement and having the clarity of the impact is, of course, key. And you brought up so many good points there about using standards and choosing what you're measuring. Because if you try to measure everything perfectly, it will become impossible. It will become impossible to communicate anything. But while there is that clarity, it will of course be very helpful in communicating to investors, but also to the clients and users at the end. But I'm also interested in knowing, well, from Eleni, but also from the others, like, how do you see this as an entrepreneur when you're founding a company? Do you have the bandwidth and the clarity to think about these questions from a communications perspective, or how do you see that and how do you experience that?
Sure. So my little background on me is actually I came from communications, so I do think about it, and it's really hard. Definitely, I mean, as a true entrepreneur, and anyone in this call who's an entrepreneur, bandwidth is of the essence, and there's never enough time to think and do everything that you would like as an entrepreneur. However, I think, you know, for us at Sintali, we set up the company very intentionally and very consciously wanting to build, and I hate using this word now because now it's a buzzword, but a purpose-driven business. And, you know, I semi-roll my eyes at myself, but I know that I genuinely do mean that a purpose-driven business, and thinking about, you know, the impact and how are we going to do this, and how are we going to do this as a small organization. I will say, I think there are times when you hit a point where you have to say, I need to put this to one side and I need to come back to it. And I have done as good as I can do right now, which I think is hard when you really believe and really want to do something that is impact driven. Not to say that we've gone off target, but you know, I was looking at certifications, like for example, I think B Corp is one of the ones that is a great one, but even B Corp, you needed at least a year of operation first before you then went through and changed your entire governance of your company. Which makes sense on the one hand to say, okay, you need to have an established business before you can do this, but B Corp is about governance. So wouldn't that be helpful to do as you're setting up the company, instead of setting up all of your governance documents and then going back a year later and spending all the time redoing the governance documents to fit a specific certification scheme? So, you know, I think as an entrepreneur, spent a lot of time thinking about it, hit some roadblocks and kind of went putting this to one side, but I think there's a lot that needs to be done in the space, because it is very important for communicating to potential investors, to customers. We get the question, suppliers, all the time. Every single procurement document, bid, everything always asks, what are your policies in place? What are your documents, etc. So it's very, very important. I hope I answered your question. Sorry.
It was very interesting. Thank you very much. And it can be a challenge to find that in between being like, it needs to be proven and it needs to be a real impact, but at the same time it needs to be manageable, especially in the early stage and companies and small teams. But thank you for opening your thinking process on that a little bit. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Eleni, for answering that question. I do see there's a couple more people with questions. I will move on and keep those questions for the end, because I do want to give everybody the time to meet each other in the breakout rooms and do some networking. But please do keep your question, and at the end we can get back to them. If maybe you haven't already met your speaker in one of the breakout rooms and can ask directly yourself.